Hello, everyone. So good to see you once more. If you're new to the channel, then you're in luck because you've tuned in to the Patriot Preacher, where we take a journey together down the road of truth, logic, hand in proverbial hand. I am Charles Wells, and I am the Patriot Preacher. So, are you tired yet of hearing about the January 6th insurrection anniversary yet, where our illustrious leaders are basically attempting to portray the occupation of our nation's capital by Trump supporters last year as the equivalent of 9/11 or the attack of Pearl Harbor, which of course both events vaulted us into the War on Terror and World War II respectively. Their comparisons, of course, are bizarre combinations of over the top hyperbole, excruciatingly unbearable hypocrisy, and an overall attempt to distract away from one of the most failed, inept, and misguided administrations to ever occupy the Oval Office. So, on 9/11, nearly 3,000 people lost their lives, more than 6,000 were injured, and the damage cost untold billions of dollars and many years to restore the site where the Twin Towers once stood. The event, of course, launched us into wars with both Iraq and Afghanistan, where about 2,000 servicemen lost their lives in that country, along with about the same number of civilian contractors over the years. Of course, we won't get into the debacle of our recent desertion of Afghanistan. We will save that for another episode. Now, Pearl Harbor, on the other hand, cost the lives of more than 2,400 servicemen, along with 20 ships and 300 aircraft, and catapulted us into a 5-year-long world war where tens of millions of people around the world were killed or murdered and entire cities were leveled. By comparison, the Capitol riots, 5 people lost their lives in the riots that lasted only a matter of hours, really. 4 of these people were protesters, and one was a Capitol Police officer who died from a heart attack. 2 of the protesters died of some sort of heart attack, one of a drug overdose, and one of the protesters or rioters were shot, and unnecessarily so, in my humble opinion. Additionally, at no time was the nation in any kind of imminent danger of being taken over by this group of people. To even suggest that, considering the makeup of this group, extends the bounds of logical thinking and common sense to their breaking points. Now, don't get me wrong, folks. I don't agree with what these people did in the slightest. Anytime a congregation of people are protesting and they cross the line by engaging in criminal activity, as far as I'm concerned, they are no longer protesters. There's a famous saying by Benjamin Franklin, you may be familiar with it, where he says, "A mob has many heads, but no brains." People often do and say things as part of a group that they would never consider doing by themselves. And while the event, in my opinion, was an adventure into stupidity on the part of those who were involved in the January 6th, 2020 protest, to extrapolate it into the boundaries of what has been called an insurrection is beyond the pale in terms of reasonable discourse. Most of these people simply followed others into the Capitol building, which was woefully and unexcusably unprepared to keep these folks in check, especially when they had more than ample knowledge and warning of the size of the crowd. Now, I suspect that most of these people, when they woke up in the morning, didn't even imagine they would end up actually in the Capitol building. Many of these people were probably at best guilty of criminal trespass. What these people didn't count on, of course, was the double standard in which they would be treated, although they should have. Republicans go to jail for their transgressions, and Democrats, for the most part, are applauded for doing their civic duty in bringing such grievous injustices into the light of day. Yet here we are seeing a sham investigation underway conducted by the January 6th Commission with a foregone conclusion that has already been written by the committee and ready to be disseminated by their willing accomplices in the press corps. The ultimate destination of all this, of course, is to prevent former President Trump the opportunity to run again by first exaggerating this event into something more than it actually was, and to implicate him in the event so people will associate him as insurrectionist and someone who is against the rule of law in our nation. Again, their only weapon against this man is to destroy him personally because they certainly can't compete with his ideas or performance. There is a concerted effort by the FBI to find and prosecute everyone who is remotely involved in this event, and they intend to prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law, and probably beyond if they can. All sorts of money and techniques are being employed to achieve this, to include things like facial recognition and exhaustive searching of social media sites. So the question is begged, why in the world did these people think for a moment that they could even possibly get away with something as crazy as storming and occupying the Capitol building? Well, why wouldn't they really? Let's take a quick look at the riots that took place in the year before, in 2020, following the death of George Floyd. It is estimated that more than $2 billion of damage occurred during more than 500 riots. Now, while most of us would agree his death was a tragedy in terms of that it shouldn't have happened at the hands of police officers who already had Mr. Floyd subdued, any discussion on criminal justice reform was quickly overshadowed by the extensive rioting, looting, and violence that broke out in major cities such as Minneapolis, St. Louis, Seattle, and New York. Dozens of people were killed, hundreds of innocent folks were assaulted, literally thousands of businesses were looted, burned, and otherwise vandalized, many of them minority owned. This $2 billion figure, by the way, exceeds any other set for similar events in American history. And actually, this figure greatly underestimates the true cost, since this is only measuring insured cost. 75% of small businesses in this country are underinsured, while 40% have no insurance at all. The total figure also doesn't take into account things like lost sales, lost revenue, unpaid labor, and a lot of these people will never be able to recoup their losses. They lost everything. Businesses that have been around for many years, never to return because they simply can't afford to. How much generational wealth was destroyed forever for these families? One study of the 1992 Los Angeles riots concluded that not only did the destruction cause $1 billion in initial property damage, over the time it led to an economic decline of $3.8 billion in sales activity and at least $125 million in lost tax revenue in the areas where those riots occurred. Moreover, a 2005 study examining similar riots in the 1960s found a negative, persistent, and economically significant effect of the riots had on the value of black-owned housing to the degree of 10% decline in the total value of black-owned property in these cities. After all, who would want to start a business or even live where these events occurred and could occur again? They basically ran off businesses in areas who could least afford to lose business. Now, why am I getting into all of this? What does any of this have to do with the Capitol riots? Well, very simply, folks, liberal mayors and governors tied the hands of law enforcement to deal with these lawless events simply because they thought they were righteous events. They actually believed that the unlawful death of one man, who, by the way, was a lifelong criminal with whom no one would have trusted or wanted to be around if they were honest, warranted the wanton destruction of inner cities across America to the detriment of those who have to live and work there. Not only were law enforcement hands tied, but their violent activities were allowed and even applauded by leftists, to include our own very Vice President Kamala Harris, who as a candidate for the office said on The Late Show that they're not going to stop, this is a movement, and I'm telling you they're not going to stop, and everyone beware, because they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop before Election Day in November. They're not going to stop after Election Day, and everyone should take note of that on both levels, that they're not going to let up, and they should not, and we should not. Liberal mayors and governors not only rejected assistance to quell these riots, but actively supported them. Prosecutors dismissed looting and rioting charges against hundreds of protesters across the United States. Protesters who were arrested for looting or rioting in several American cities were let off the hook, as prosecutors dropped charges or enacted new laws that put them back on the streets quickly. In St. Louis, the District of Columbia, Philadelphia, New York, serious charges against hundreds of people arrested for stealing and torching property was dismissed. Those dismissals came from the federal level, by the way, in the nation's capital, from district attorneys elected with millions in campaign cash from left-wing activist George Soros. And in New York, from a bail reform measure that went into effect that year. Not only that, but President Trump offered on many occasions assistance to these cities, getting their riots under control, but was refused because they hated this man more than they loved their own cities and citizenry. Yet here we are, a year later, watching the same folks who allow so much violence and destruction to occur, unnecessarily so, opine at length at how our republic narrowly avoided a military coup at the hands of Trump supporters. And lastly, we saw our nation's capital being occupied by military troops for months after this incident occurred in an unprecedented fashion that's never happened before. For you see, the last useful purpose that the Capitol riot served was to enact procedures and laws that prevent future protests that people in power deem not to be in the best interests of our country. I have to say that I'm very curious as to how these Capitol riots will be truly portrayed in the annals of history. As we move forward, how will we see these riots? Will there be an honest appraisal of this event? Or will it be twisted so as to be seen as the narrow aversion of our entire nation being taken over by right-wing lunatics? In any case, I hope that 2022 is somewhat less eventful than 2021 or 2020. I have to admit that I'm very ready, as I'm sure many of you are, to see some normalcy return to our great nation. As the midterms approach, make sure you do your due diligence and research and get out there and vote, folks. It is time for us to take back the Senate and Congress to avert the real damage that the Biden agenda has in store for our country and what amounts to a real insurrection via political subterfuge. It's about time for me to sign off for now. I hope you enjoyed our little incursion and discussion about the January 6th Capitol protesters and rioters. If you're interested in this or many other topics like it, please take the time to get notifications, make related comments, and most of all, hit that little subscribe button in the bottom right-hand corner. Of course, to become a loyal listener. Until next time, I wish you well and your families as we push forward into a hopefully less violent and volatile 2022. Until we meet again, I wish you all the best, goodbye, and God bless.